Hey everybody, and welcome back. This is going to be the second iteration in my series of videos about the line of battle game system. If you watched the first video, we talked about what the system is generally, and we also discussed the sequence of play, which will give most players an idea of how the game flows. It's an I go, you go, that type of thing. In this video, I want to focus a little bit more on the components, some concepts, and basic game information represented on the counters, the units, all that type thing. You'll see in front of me I've pulled out some counters. This is the Last Chance for Victory module representing the Battle of Gettysburg. We have the Union Iron Brigade here from the 1st Corps, Archers Brigade that met them in these woods right here, and just a few random artillery units and a few cavalry units. So what I want to start off by talking about is these counters themselves, these combat units, and what all this information on them actually represents. So what you'll see in front of you is your infantry in a line formation, your artillery in an unlimbered formation, and your cavalry, which are in open order formation. There's 4 basic formations that units are going to be in. It's either going to be line, column, mounted, or open order. For artillery, they're either going to be limbered or unlimbered. If you take a look at these infantry units, you can go in here and flip these guys, and the back side of their counter is going to show that they are in column. It kind of has a faded view, and it'll say COL at the top. These units are going to have a different set of movement points than units in line, and there's going to be penalties for being attacked when you're in column, and obviously you don't want to be closing on the enemy when you're in column. It's not a good idea. I've done it before. Don't do that. I guess in general, you want to be in line formation when you're approaching an enemy position. You don't want to be in column. Column is the formation that you want to be in when you're moving on roads because you gain those benefits. We'll talk about movement points and all that type stuff once we get a little bit more into the activity phase and we start moving some counters around. Just know that the counters themselves don't flip to a disorganized state or anything like that. They are strictly showing the formation of that unit that's on the counter. These cavalry are unique in the fact that they are considered open order. This is represented by this bugle up here at the top of the counter, and they have some very unique attributes because they are open order. For instance, they're going to be able to change their facing for free, which units in line are not going to be able to do. They're going to have an ability to skirt out of an enemy's clutches. If they're closing in on them, they're going to be able to move out of zone of controls. And they're also going to be more apt to retreat if fired upon. It's a benefit to them not necessarily being lined up. They might be using the terrain to their advantage a little bit better. Those are things we'll talk about a little bit more. Just know that that's what that represents. You can see these guys in line formation. They all kind of have a little graphic of line infantry. Looks like they're shooting off into the distance. So let's talk about unit identification. Take, for instance, the 19th Indiana here. It shows the 19th Indiana shows iron/1/1. That means that the 19th Indiana Regiment is a part of the Iron Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Corps. We can pull up the rule book. There's a real nice graphic example up in here that shows this. For instance, you can see that they've got a regiment from the Texan Brigade of Hood's Division. One nice thing that this series does is it will color code all of the different corps. So the Union, they're going to be bringing, 5 or 6 corps here in Gettysburg. Each one of those corps is going to have a different shade of blue or light green or purple, and it's going to give you a quick way to look at the map and determine where people are at. One thing that I found difficult when I was picking up the game was learning what all this information meant right here, the Iron 1-1. So figuring out, okay, if this is the 2-1-1, okay, that's the other brigade in the 1st Division of the 1st Corps. Those are some things that might take some time to get used to. They're really not that difficult once you get into it, but it does make it easier if you are familiar with the command structure of an army, which I think I talked about in the first video. To the bottom left of these counters, you're going to see a letter and a number. This is going to represent the weaponry and the unit strength. All of them, whether it's artillery, cavalry, or infantry, are all going to have those values on their counter. The letter is going to represent what weaponry that regiment or section of guns currently has. So for instance, you'll see the Iron Brigade, they are all R's. That means they are all carrying rifles. These rifles are going to have specific attributes based on, let's see here, let's just pull this up real quick so you guys can get a quick peek. I wish I could zoom in on that a little bit better, but there's a chart that comes on the player aid handout that will have all the weapon characteristics. It's going to give you the max range, what the call out is for it on the counter, and any special notes. For instance, muskets have a max range of 2, but they also have the special ability of buck and ball, which is going to be a shift on the combat table if they're at a certain range. Rifled muskets can reach out a little bit further. Their max range is going to be 4 hexes. They don't have any special notes, but they can also sit back and plink at units with muskets if those guys with the muskets can't close. So just going down the list here, you've got carbines, Sharps rifles, Henry repeaters, pistols, shotguns, all sorts of stuff. Not all of those are going to be used very often. For the most part, you're going to have rifles and muskets. For artillery, you're going to have these options over here. Same thing for the most part. You're going to have a max range for rifled cannon, for instance. Napoleons, those are going to be the main 2 that you're going to see. And also their special characteristics are going to involve how their canister is fired. So a normal canister unit is going to get 1 shift on their combat table if units are moving within that range, whereas a Napoleon, for instance, can fire dense canister. They're going to get a 2-column shift. So those guys are not units that you want to be charging directly in front of, unless you want to take a lot of casualties, which, hey, by all means, do what you want to do. So that's the letters. The numbers next to those are going to be the strengths of the units. So you'll see here we have 8, 6, 10, 6, 4, 3, so on and so forth. Those are going to be representing 50 soldiers for each multiplier of 1. So a C3 is going to be 150 guys with carbine, or not carbines. Is it carbines? Yeah, carbines. A guy that's an R10 is going to be 500 guys with rifles. Those are numbers that are going to be continually whittled away as you play the game. Every time you enter combat, there's good chances that you're going to be taking losses. In fact, you're definitely going to be taking losses. So I'm looking up here. I was hoping there's a counter that I could show you, but actually in the modules, you actually just click it here. Oops, not that. And you decrease the embedded strength. If I could pull this over real quick, you'll be able to see right here, there is a counter that shows strength points. These are basically going to be rotated as your units take losses. One other thing that I find extremely helpful is if you go to the Gamers website, you can download the unit rosters. And as you take losses, if you're playing solo or opposed, I like it both ways. You can mark off the losses that you take on paper instead of using those little counters. I like to do both. It's nice to be able to look at a formation or a command quickly and say, okay, these guys are decimated. I probably don't want them to be involved in my major assault on this position. let's go send them somewhere else. While we're on the subject of unit strength, we can briefly talk about the concept of smallness. In these games, any regiment that goes under 3 SP, so 150 men, is going to be considered small. They're not going to be able to cover the frontage of the hex that would be required at this scale. And those units are usually going to incur some negative modifiers on their morale charts, and there's some other little things that come into gameplay. We'll get into that in a little bit. Just know that once you get whittled down to a certain point, you can't just throw regiments into positions to plug gaps without having some sort of negative consequence of doing that. Along with the concept of smallness, there's also a wrecked status for units that are below their 50% original strength. This only happens to infantry and cavalry, but it's got some really bad effects on the units themselves. They can't successfully close with the enemy. They apply some terrible modifiers on the morale table, and there's some negative shifts when they're taking opening volley shots. Being wrecked can be pretty brutal. Once you start accumulating a bunch of regiments within a brigade or a bunch of brigades within a division that are considered wrecked, you're going to start affecting your ability to carry out attacks, and your leaders are going to want to start fluking out on their attacks. I try to avoid being wrecked at all costs. Sometimes you can't just because you're pressing the attack. Obviously, if you need to take positions, you got to do what you got to do, but that's part of the fun of the game. You're the commander, so you decide how hard you're going to push your boys. So let's go ahead and finish up our discussion about these counters by talking about morale. In my opinion, morale is going to be the single most important factor for any regiment or section of guns. You'll see on these counters that the letter on the bottom right is going to be different for some of them. So if you look here, the 13th Alabama has a C, the 5th Alabama Battalion has a B, and everybody in the Iron Brigade has an A. This is going to be a measure of how effective the unit is going to be on the battlefield. That's what you're going to use when you're determining if your units are going to close with the enemy. You're going to roll on this morale table, which I'll pull up for you, when you take fire, and that's going to determine whether or not your units hold their ground or if they falter. And it's also going to determine how quickly they take losses during their retreats. Because stragglers are not manually kept track of in this game, it's kind of integrated into the morale table. When you receive fire and a result happens, you're going to be forced to take a morale check. So if you look in the A column, you need to roll a 10 in order to get a negative result. If you are a B morale, you need to roll a 9 in order to get a negative result. Now, there's all sorts of modifiers that are going to add into that. There are some that are going to be negatives. If you're behind stone walls, if you're on higher elevations, things like that, those are going to be defensive benefits. But for the most part, if you look up here at the morale table modifiers, everything is pretty much going to be bad. Being shaken or disorganized, wrecked is terrible, as I just talked about. Taking fire from your rear instead of your frontal facing. All sorts of things are going to affect how you react to taking fire combat, and also how quickly you incur losses during your retreats. That is denoted by these L results. You'll notice that a D unit is going to start to take L2 results during their retreat, which are going to be 2-step losses, a lot sooner than an A-rated unit will. And that's representing the loss of stragglers based on cohesion and all sorts of things. So if you're playing a physical copy of the game and you're not playing on Vassal, you'll be using a bunch of counters to keep track of what your morale status is going to be. So if you look here, you'll see that there's a Bloodlust, Shaken, Disorganized, and a Rout. As you receive fire and it's not a terrible result. It might be a shaken. It doesn't really affect you other than if you receive more fire, it's going to affect your subsequent morale checks. A step down from that is going to be disorganized. At this level, you're going to incur some disadvantages when you're taking fire combat and also when you're trying to move. And a step down from that is being routed. Routed units are going to continually fall back from the front line. You're not going to be able to really control what they're doing. You're not going to be able to throw them up to plug a gap or something like that. And they're actually going to require a die roll of a 5 or a 6 to rally during the rally phase. Now, leaders have the ability of coming around to these routed units and assisting their ability to rally. We'll talk about that once we talk about leaders. All right, so let's talk about leaders. What you'll see in front of you here, let's see if I can zoom in any further, is going to be the counter for Joseph Hooker. Whoa, I'm all over the place. So at the very top, you have his name. Underneath that, you're going to have his rank and his command. And importantly, on the bottom left, you're going to have the command level symbol. Now, I'm not sure if these symbols are on the old RSS counters. I really don't know. I haven't popped those open to look. But the command level symbol is going to indicate that the leader has a physical HQ counter on the map. That's going to be important from an orders perspective. I'm not going to get too involved in that in this video just because it's a whole nother can of worms that we can open up. But many divisional and most brigade leaders are not going to have that. They are not going to have physical HQ counters on the map. They kind of operate as the center of the command. If you look at the two values to the bottom right of the counter, you're going to notice that they're the command value and the morale value. These are going to be functions for both things that these leaders can undertake. The first one being their command value. From a command and control perspective, leaders are going to be what you use to command the troops. They're used to issue, receive, undertake, and modify orders. And orders are what allow the formations of combat units to work towards an objective. The higher the better. Lower numbers mean leaders will be less likely to issue initiative, undertake orders in a timely fashion, or maintain the impetus of an attack that they might be trying to undertake. And worsely, if you're a brigade leader and this value is a 0, you must roll for your brigade each turn to see if they can even move. On a 1, they are kind of confused. They can't do anything. On a 2 to 3, they can move half their movement points. And on a 4, 5, or 6, they can move normally. The morale level is going to be used at a more frontline battlefield level. They're going to be using their morale value to assist any regiment they're stacked with in closing with the enemy. Perhaps you want to charge a particular part of the line and you need to have a leader in there so that you can ensure that they are able to make that attack. They're going to assist in passing morale checks. So a morale level unit like Hooker, who's a 4, is going to give a -4 on that morale table that we just looked at. That can be huge. They're also going to add that morale value to the die roll you take during the rally phase to try to get any routed units back in the action. This is important for a few reasons. It gives leaders the ability to keep lower morale rated units in specific parts of the line if you need them to hold. So let's go ahead and look at this. For instance, if we have the 13th Alabama over here and we had a decent leader, well, I have a C-rated unit on the flank of my entire brigade. I might want to throw a leader on there so that if he's forced to take a morale check, let's pull that up, he's going to get a negative to his roll. So if he rolls an 11, we're going to apply, let's say we have a 4 morale rated leader, a -4 is going to put it to a 7. That's going to be no effect. He's going to stand there instead of taking a disorganized retreat for loss of 1. So that can be extremely important. But that also comes at a cost. You're going to be exposing your leaders to enemy fire if you put yourself in these situations. Anytime a stack with a leader takes an SP loss, the player who caused the loss, which is fun because the player who caused it gets to roll the die, makes a leader kill roll. For small arms, the only results that are really going to happen are 11 or 12. We can show you that here. It's going to be this table down here. And being killed by fire is fairly rare. It's not as rare as you would think it would be. An 11 or a 12 happens a lot more than you'd like to when you have brigade and divisional leaders or corps leaders on the front line. Where you really have to make some tough decisions is when you're using leaders in charges. If you are the attacker and the defender causes a step loss during opening volley, they are going to attempt to kill your attacking leader. All they need to roll is an 8. If they roll an 8, he's going to be wounded. If he rolls a 9 through 12, that guy's dead. Same thing when you're defending against charge. It's a little bit more difficult. You need a 10 or an 11 or a 12, but there are still fairly decent chances that you're going to be losing leaders. These are some of the most tense moments in the game when you have critical charges where you have a really good leader going in there and you hope that you can pass that that leader loss table check so that you can apply your modifier to the defender's morale check. So a leader who has a 4 morale that's attacking in a charge is then going to cause the defending player to apply a +4 to his morale check. And that can be absolutely devastating. So a bad roll for, let's say, a B unit would be a 9. Well, you add 4 to that, and you totally hose a regiment that's there. And you can open up some pretty huge breaches in an enemy line. Those are all decisions that the player needs to make. A lot of times it doesn't make sense to have your leaders on the front lines just because you don't want them to die. So let's pull these guys over. Here's some examples. So Wadsworth, the 2-2 leader, is actually the divisional commander that the Iron Brigade is a part of. I have a tendency to get my divisional commanders a little too close to the front lines, and I like for them to be involved. I incur a lot of losses with my divisional leaders, but at the same time, for me, if they're decent, a 2-2 is actually pretty good. That's a leader that you don't really want to lose. Once you start getting 0-1 replacements, which are the back sides of these, you lose the ability to accept orders, issue initiative, and be relatively functional. A 4-4 is basically a god. You want to keep them around as long as possible. You'll see here a Meade is a 3-1, so anytime he's stacked with a unit and they would take fire, he would apply a -1 to their morale check. I don't think that would probably be a good idea to have Meade up there, but hey, you can do what you want. Same thing with Slocum. He's a wing leader. You can see that he has the star there, which is going to mean that he has a physical HQ on the map. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about HQs once we start pushing some counters and talking about orders. So the last thing I want to talk about is line of sight and terrain within the series. It's fairly unique to other games that I've played just because of how the map is portrayed. If you look, you'll notice that the terrain lines and the elevation changes aren't confined to the edges of the hexes. Whereas if you've played the old CWB games, those are basically going to be one terrain level per hex. It goes up to another terrain level in the next hex. That's not the case on this map. This map takes on more of a, I don't know if it's a realistic, I don't know if that's what I would call it. I don't know if topographical is the right term to use. I'm not a cartographer. I think those are people that make maps. I could be wrong. What I will tell you is that I think it looks fantastic. Let's take a look at the overall map for Gettysburg. This is Last Chance for Victory. And you'll see that it just takes on a fairly natural view. It doesn't look to me like it was created by a game designer, which I think is awesome. I've heard people express complaint about the way the map is done, and to me, they're either just nitpicking or they, I don't know. I don't know what the deal is there. I mean, I guess everybody has their own opinions. I think they look great. One thing that I did notice that took me some time to get used to is the way the location of the actual units within the hex are determined. What Dean says is firing and target units are always assumed to be on the highest height in their hex, but within that constraint, the firing player decides the unit's exact location. So what that means to me is a unit firing from this location who is targeting a unit in this location is going to be firing from this highest point, and this defending unit is going to be on this highest point. Interesting enough, when you're stringing line of sight, you can take it from anywhere in the hex to anywhere in the other hex. So with that being said, it gives you the ability to potentially skirt obstacles and other things of that nature. One thing that you'll find is that these crest lines add an obstacle height, so they really create some hindrances for units that want to be located in valleys and fire through basically hills. You can't do that, obviously. Each elevation change is an obstacle. Your trees and forests in this game series are going to add a +3 to those obstacles, and it can get a little bit tricky every so often. What has been provided is what is called the slope table. Let me see if I can pull that up and find that real quick. And it's basically a formula that you can use to determine whether or not units can see each other. You take the difference between the firing unit and the target unit, and you find the overall distance in terrain, and that's going to give you a overall slope. Then you're going to take the modified level of the endpoint where the fire is going and any obstacles that might be in the way, and you're going to do the same thing. That's going to give you another slope. If the obstacle slope is greater than the overall slope, it's going to be blocked. It sounds really confusing. It can be when you're starting, but really 95% of the line of sight issues can just be done by eyeballing it. Can somebody from, let's see where we've got our guys up here. Let me pull a counter down here. Can this guy see this guy? The answer is yes. The slope is going down into this kind of ravine. They can obviously see each other, in my opinion. He's kind of assumed that he's on one of these higher elevated terrains. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to see each other, unless you're sitting there nitpicking, in which case you probably don't want to play with me. Can this guy see this guy? No, because there's forest in the way. Can this guy see this guy? No, because this crest line right here is going to add a +1 obstacle height. Even though they're on the same terrain level, this crest line is basically blocking the line of sight. Every elevation change in this game represents about 20 foot, so that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to visualize line of sight. Normally when you have infantry close in, it's pretty easy to determine. If you're firing artillery at long ranges, then it gets a little bit trickier. But really, I would not get hung up on it. My advice would just be play the game, play it. If it makes sense, do it. If it doesn't, then don't do it. It's pretty much common sense is what you can invoke in this instance for line of sight. So that's pretty much all I have right now. I think we went over the majority of the components, the unit counters, the leaders, the terrain. I think that's going to give us a basis so that we can start moving in the activity phase, and you have an idea of what all the values mean on all of the units and such like that. So I think in the next video what I'm going to do is set up a small scenario. We will start moving some counters. We'll start going through movement. We'll talk about facing. We'll probably get into some opening volleys. We'll make some combat rolls, which will give us some morale checks. We'll look at some status disruptions, and we'll kind of see how things play out and give you a feel for how the game flows. And hopefully you see how much fun it is and how much I enjoy it. And we'll go from there. So until I talk to you guys then, have a good one.